Well, joining me now is historian Raphael Israeli. He's a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he emigrated to Israel in the aftermath of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. In Tel Aviv, we have Haaretz journalist Gideon Levy, who works at the newspaper that published the investigation. And in Amman is Palestinian journalist and Middle East analyst Daoud Kuttab. Good to have you all on the program. Raphael Israeli, if I could start with you. It's a fascinating report in Haaretz by Hagar Shezaf. It's called Burying the Nakba, How Israel Systematically Hides Evidence of 1948 Expulsion of Arabs. Were you surprised by these findings?
Haaretz is a so-called liberal newspaper which can be accused, rightly so, with a very strong bias against anything that Israel does. It's the Palestinians who are saints, the Israelis are the villains. And with that kind of line, you cannot be surprised at anything that Haaretz writes. I have been myself victim of things that I have published on other issues, like the Israeli Arabs,
so
which
let's
they
take Haaretz for a
distorted.
second. Certainly, let's take Haaretz for a second and their standing and their political affiliation, or what you claim to be their political affiliation, and park that off for a second. Benny Morris is not a lefty. He's a famed Israeli historian, right? He says this is totalitarian. He calls this policy totalitarian by Malmab, which is the group in the government that is now making unavailable these historical archives. So forget Haaretz for a second. Benny Morris saying, trying to look for the same sources that he used for his previous books, he went back and tried to revisit them. And when he went to look for them, to look at issues such as Deir Yassin, where Arab villages were massacred, he was told this is unavailable now. You can't have access to these archives. As a historian, is that acceptable to you, sir?
I think you mix here many things together.
Tell me what.
Benny Morris is my friend, and I respect him very much, and he's a very good historian. But I stand to argue with him many issues about 1948, and I have written even a book called Old Historians, New Historians, No Historians. And I have there a series of events in 1948 which he misdescribes and he distorted or misjudged. And I argue those matters with him. The other issue which is separate is the issue of state archives who take for themselves the responsibility to release certain materials and to forbid the release of other materials which even after 40 years or 50 years can still do damage to the country or to its intelligence or to certain individuals who can be hurt and so on and so forth. Now, it's not for Benny Morris or myself or anybody outside the authorities to judge what is hurting to Israel and what is not.
So before I bring in the other guests, I just want to ask you about a very specific historical record in these archives, right? For example, now this was something that was previously published, which is now unavailable. That's why we still have access to it. It's from the village of Sufsaf in Safed district, 29th October 1948. Yosef Vashitz, a member of MPM's, United Workers' Party, a Zionist leftist party. Arab section, writing, Sufsaf, they took 52 men, tied them to one another, dug a ditch and shot them. 10 were still squirming. Women came begging for mercy. The bodies of 6 old men were found. There were 61 bodies, 3 cases of rape. One of the rapists was a Mizrahi man from Safed. A 14-year-old girl was one of the rape victims. 4 men were shot and killed. One of them had his fingers removed by a knife so as to take the ring. So we cannot find this account anymore in the archives. Do you believe that this is justified for Israeli national security?
No, of course you cannot judge one specific event only. War is a horrible thing. Many horrors were done on both parties, and they were released, and some of them were never released to the public. But that doesn't say anything, because I cannot now take a specific event that you quote
I'm giving you an
and
example.
tell you what.
Certainly. But I'm giving you an example. Yes.
You quote an example.
Of course.
I have to see the quote and to verify whether it's true or not.
But
you
sir,
can
you've
say
already.
anything.
But sir, you've already accepted the government Malmab's rationale here that it's okay for them to make this unavailable. That's why I'm asking you, and I'm giving you an example, because you have already decided that they're right to do this. So that's why I asked, okay, here's an example of one specific thing that they've now made unavailable. Do you get it?
Okay.
Okay, okay,
If you...
Okay, fair enough. Let's bring in Gideon Levy. Gideon Levy, part of the criticism is that, well, it's those Haaretz lefties who hate Israel, so why should we expect anything other than this nonsense from Haaretz? I've seen some of this as a response from people on the right in Israel. Tell me your initial reaction, Gideon, to coming across this information that the archives have been archived, if you like.
The year is 2019, and it's hard to believe that this debate is still taking on. There was a Nakba, there was an ethnic cleansing, 700,000 Palestinians had to leave their homes and were never allowed back. Over 400 villages were destroyed and erased without giving them any kind of memory, even not a sign. Me, as a product of Israeli education system, I never learned anything about the Nakba. The Nakba is denied in this country because we believe that if we deny it, it didn't take place. But it took place. It never stopped, by the way, until today. The policy remained the same policy, over 70 years now. But in any case, this investigation of Haaretz, you asked before the distinguished professor if it was a surprise. How can it be a surprise when you go around Israel and you don't see one single memory of a whole life of a whole people who lived here, and half of it has to leave and half of it could never come back to their homes? How can you be surprised that some details in archives were erased when so many villages were erased, you know, covered with forests, covered up with all kinds of stories, and Israel never took any kind of responsibility, moral responsibility to what happened?
Daoud Kuttab, according to one of the documents that has been redacted, 70% of the Arabs left as a result of Jewish military operations, right? Which is fundamentally the Palestinian narrative, to say the vast majority of people were driven out of their homes and they didn't just get up and leave and felt that the Arab armies were going to reconquer and they were going to come back, right? When you read this and you see that some of it has been covered up, do you feel any sense of vindication that the Palestinian narrative of the Nakba is getting supported by historical documents, or the fact that maybe the Israeli state is trying to cover it up, which means that it strengthens the Palestinian narrative at all?
Well, I mean, obviously we believe in the Palestinian narrative. There's no doubt in our minds. We know it. We talk to people who are relatives. My father is a product of the Nakba. He lost his house in Mustara. My cousin was killed in 1948. So we don't need the archives to tell us what happened. But clearly what is happening has nothing to do with the security, as the professor said, or we're trying to cover up something for the sake of people who 70 years ago, who would be 90 years old now, if they were really young, are still alive. I think that's clearly a question of trying to cover up the Israeli narrative and trying to deny the Palestinians' right to have, as Gideon said, that Israel take responsibility, moral and legal responsibility, for causing the Palestinian refugee crisis. Once they do that, then I think we can talk about whether most few would return or not. But until the Israelis take responsibility for what they've caused, which is the Palestinian refugee crisis, there is not going to be any resolution to the right of return. Obviously, as Mahmoud Abbas said, Palestinians are not planning to flood Israel. And Mahmoud Abbas said, I want to visit Safad. I don't want to live in Safad. but it's not going to be resolved. There's not going to be historical reconciliation until the Israeli public and the Israeli government allows the Israeli public to understand what happened, to take responsibility so that we can have a kind of a resolution in which we can live somehow with whatever has been left after 70 years of this Nakba.
Right.
That's the basic need.
Raphael Israeli, one of the things that we're hearing from the other two guests is the suggestion that the state feels the need to hide, to obfuscate, to sanitize history so that there's no existential guilt when it comes to the current Israeli population, that they don't have to have any seeds of doubt when it comes to the legitimacy of their state. Is that a worthy goal for historians and for archives?
Well, look, the question is a question of good measure, because from the discussion I hear now, there is a clear indication that the intention is not to tell a historical truth, but to bash Israel. And that I do not accept. There are horrors that were made in the war, but the Palestinians are not victims or saints because of that. Both sides did horrible things. The Palestinians, many massacres, and the Israelis, many massacres too. There were many Palestinians who were killed or who were expelled, and that is true. But they don't tell you that 6,000 Israelis also, 1% of the Israeli population, was killed in that war of 1948, where the 600,000 Jews in the country were battling for their independence. That they don't tell you. All they wanted is to eliminate the Jewish population and its striving to independence. That they don't tell you. They strove to do that, and the price that they paid is all the horrors that happened to them. The horrors are terrible on both sides, but they should not pose themselves as people who have a clean narrative, everything is fine, and those horrible Jews did the most horrible things.
None of the other two guests have said any of that. However, Gideon, let me give you an opportunity to respond.
This is a very typical way to describe the Israeli narrative. Israel is always the victim. As an occupier, Israel is a victim because Israel never meant to occupy for over 52 years the occupied territories. It was all forced on us. Israel was never meant to make this ethnic cleansing of 700,000 Palestinians in 48. It was all forced on us, and we are just the pure victim. The second narrative is that it's equally bad. Both sides did terrible things. No, it's not like this, because Israel is responsible for the Nakba, and the Nakba contains a national tragedy which was never repaired for the Palestinian people, who is bleeding until today. And Israel is a strong regional superpower living in freedom, in prosperity, while the Palestinians continue to bleed in the refugee camps, under the occupation, in the siege in Gaza. So, this ridiculous portrait of symmetry between the two parties is obviously ridiculous. Last thing I would like to mention is that the more Israel denies it and the more aggressive it becomes in archives or in anything else, the more you understand how much Israel feels guilty. Because would we really feel so just about what happened? What's the problem? Why should we hide? Why do we hide all the villages that were destroyed? Let's put a sign to each village. What's the problem? But we know we did something wrong. We know that the whole moral basis is rotten. And therefore, we have to deny and to hide. I wish that Israelis will feel strong enough and just enough to say the truth. Yes, there was a Nakba. Yes, there were crimes. And now it's about time to compensate, to take responsibility, and to open a new chapter. This never happened.
Daoud Kuttab, I wonder if you see a connection between what we're discussing and what has recently been in the news from East Jerusalem. So Israel won a legal battle against Palestinians in East Jerusalem. the residents of Sur Bahar, for a safety issue connected to the wall. They said the Supreme Court, by the way, rubber stamped this, so it's legal. These homes were bulldozed and blown up, Palestinian homes, for safety reasons. They don't exist anymore. Now, people are saying among the Palestinian community in East Jerusalem that this is going to be confiscated for settlements and so on. We don't know what's going to happen down the road. But do you see a connection between what we're discussing about the events of 1948 and what's happening on the ground right now in East Jerusalem, Daoud?
No, actually, I don't see. I see a connection much more with what's happening in Gaza, with the March of the Return. That's where the real connection is, because that's where the product of this Nakba actually exists. I mean, many more Palestinian refugees live in Gaza than in the West Bank. Yes, there are about 17% in the West Bank, but there's over 50% of the population of Gaza, which is under siege, which is totally denied access, is totally under a big cage. So I see much more comparison there. What happened in Sur Bahar is actually the death not of had nothing to do with Nakba as much as with the Oslo Accords, because these are homes that were built in areas that are supposed to be parts of areas under Palestinian security and administrative control. In other words, the Palestinian government gave the license to build, and they're destroying them not because of anything, but just because they decided that they want to create a security wall on these lands or nearby these lands. So I really think the issue here is much more connected to the wider return and of the march of the people in Gaza and the demands of Palestinians to have this issue. Israel recognize its moral and legal responsibility.
Oh, so let me then ask Gideon, can homes in East Jerusalem be bulldozed and blown up and no one blinks an eye? Because if you view if you've grown up on the narrative that the Palestinians don't have a right to be there at all and that no crimes were committed against them, it makes it easier for this stuff to happen. Might that be a connection, Gideon?
I think there is a connection, and I tend to disagree with my friend Daoud, because I think it comes from the same place. My problem with the Nakba is that it never stopped, as I said before. The same principles, the same policy over 70 years. Would it stop at 48? I would have agreed with Professor Israeli. Every war has its ugly sides, its crimes, and let's continue. But it never stopped. What happened in Sur Bahar yesterday is a direct continuous of the thought that the Palestinians have no right in this land, that only the Jews have the right to live here in equality and in a democracy. Not only this, but also international law. International agreements that Israel is signed on are worth nothing. Because of Israel's security.
Raphael Israeli, Gideon Levy, and Daoud Kuttab, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.